I can't remember what it was this week, but something reminded me of a book that I wanted to mention and talk about tonight because it's really, I think, one of the finest books about integrity that I know, though I don't know if it even uses that word. Um, this is a book by Don Miguel Ruiz, The Four Agreements. Many of you may have heard of it. Um, he's a Toltec teacher from Mexico. And so the language is certainly not Buddhism. Perhaps for that very reason, it can be very helpful to read it because it puts you in a whole different idiom. But in his wisdom teaching, in his tradition, they have four agreements, which are, I think, very similar to the Buddhist training precepts, similar to precepts that one takes to develop greater consciousness around something. Of course, also with the intention to keep this precept. But whether one keeps it or not, there's a certain kind of consciousness that develops around it. And so I thought I'd just name the four and maybe talk about one of them, which has overlap with what we're talking about, what I've already talked about here. But there's something about them. They're so simple. It's a small book. The print is very large with a lot of white space, a lot of space in it. So it isn't a lot of words. And but they're powerful. So the first agreement is be impeccable with your word. Be impeccable with your word. The second is the one that I always remember, when it comes to the four agreements. I read this years ago, and the second one was the one that totally stuck with me. Don't take anything personally. Don't take anything personally. The third is don't make assumptions. And the last is always do your best. So, did you not hear that, Elaine? Always do your best. Okay. So be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best. When I hear the first one, be impeccable with your word, where my mind goes is, the kind of promises that we make to people, whether we keep them or not, whether we, promise to get something done and we do, or whether we say we're going to be somewhere and we are, or whether we easily break those sorts of agreements. That's not actually what he's talking about. I don't know that he mentions that at all. Instead, what he points to is the power of words. That words are what create your life, and they have an enormous, enormous impact. He gives the example of a mother who came home to her singing child. Children can be very exuberant and dancing, singing, and she had a headache. And she snapped at the child and said, your singing is ugly. Stop it. And he spoke about the power of that to change that child for the worse. To where she became self-conscious about her voice rather than totally at ease with it. He talks about the power of words to bless and curse. Those are really the words to speak well of something or speak ill of something. It's a very powerful thing that we have as human beings. by speaking well of somebody or something, we have the power to make it blossom. I was talking also this week with someone about just my sense that it's so important that you not praise your children, but that you trust them and that they'll live up to that. It's kind of a way of blessing them. It's maybe a tricky parental tactic to, but I don't actually think it is. I think it's very straightforward. That sometimes with your words of suspicion, people feel untrustworthy. Children can feel untrustworthy. Or even with your helping, you're giving advice. There may be a subtle sense that you can't figure this out yourself. Or you don't have what it takes. I need to prop you up. There's all sorts of ways. The parental-child relationship is such a powerful one. And it's such a place to remember this, this first agreement, to be impeccable with your word. And so oftentimes I notice in the political arena how there is the belief that cursing is a powerful thing to do. It is a powerful thing to do, but I don't know that it necessarily leads to what you want it to. To curse your opponent, to curse the people you disagree with, is to, in some way, put them in a negative light. The people who disagree with me are bad people. Some way or another, I constantly get that flavor in people's political conversations. Because they don't understand another person's point of view, they must therefore be coming from a very bad or evil place. They're greedy, or they're stupid, so forth. There's constantly these curses that are leveled in the name of telling it like it is. So I remember learning back in debate. I was a high school debater. That the rule was you had to first be able to formulate someone else's opinion in words that they themselves would agree, yes, that's how I think. That's the first step. If you want to actually persuade anybody, is you have to show them that you understand their opinion and that you can present it in ways that they themselves will say, yes, that's why I hold that opinion. That's why I think that's so. And only then do you actually have the power to persuade, to say, okay, I understand that, but here's actually where I'm coming from and the way that I see it. This is the evidence I'm looking at that says that that's not true. Or, this is the value that I'm holding as primary. So that kind of discourse is unfortunately getting more and more old-fashioned, the kind of discourse where you actually tell somebody that and how you understand them and give them the opportunity to correct you if you're wrong. This is kind of what I'm understanding you're thinking. Tell me if I'm right. Is this actually the way that you view things? And is this why you see it that way? So you take time that way to gather, and then your word is actually more powerful because you're not trying to curse the other person. If you're telling them about themselves, you've probably made a mistake. You're just judging. If you start telling somebody, and it usually comes from an unwholesome feeling state. I noticed that in myself, that if I'm analyzing my spouse, there's usually some kind of irritation there. There's some kind of aversion. And the perspective, the actual glasses that I'm looking through are colored in a certain way. They're not actually seeing things as they are. And it's so easy to do that. It's so easy to cast other people in a certain light, which is just the light of your own aversion. So to be impeccable with one's word is to notice that, and to notice where your words are coming from. Notice the state of mind that is generating a word. In Buddhism, we talk about that in terms of right speech or attuned speech. So, what's the power? The power of words arises from the state of mind that they're coming from. The power to do ill or the power to do well, one or the other. So he actually says this is the hardest agreement of all four of them, is to actually be impeccable with your word. To always be aware, what is the impact of what I'm saying? And where is it coming from inside? And is it actually not only true, but is it kind? And he extends that not just to the words we say to others, but this is really important, to the words we say to ourselves. You may be somebody who's very kind to other people and be very unkind to yourself. What's that about? What's about that's this inner speech about that we say things to ourselves we'd never say to somebody else. Though actually, I notice that if I do talk more to myself in these harsh ways, it does leak out a little to other people. I hate to say it. Usually the people who are closest to me are the ones that get that kind of annoyance. But, I remember even as a child noticing this about my parents, their way of talking to themselves. My mother would often, be frustrated and call herself stupid, which is always, it always kind of like, as a child, it's just like, I understood, she was frustrated, but it was such a notable thing. And then lo and behold, I find there's a voice inside of me that does the same thing. When I drop something on the floor, it's ready to curse. Like, that's a horrible thing. There's that sort of energy is also in me, that kind of push to do things right and not make any mistakes and so forth. So to be impeccable with your word is to notice the things you say to yourself too. To have whatever you say to yourself reflect your deepest values. If it does, then it's going to be kind, I would imagine, and loving. And it kind of flows into the second agreement, because what I find is the part of us that takes things personally, it's like reactivity to someone else is often what leads us to use our words, the power of our words, wrongly. If somebody else uses their words wrongly in a certain way, or maybe they're not even doing that, maybe, they just make sort of an offhanded comment that in some way you feel hurt by, or you feel, it arouses emotions in you. It's very often the case that you're taking something personally. If they, walked out the door and didn't say goodbye, if they forgot you in some way else than that, it's very easy for us to take that personally. It's like, don't I matter? Hey, I'm here. And there's something quite natural about that, you know. I find even with my dog, I feel like I acknowledge her. I don't just ignore her. Something, is kind of deeply disturbing as a human being to be just ignored. So I'm not saying that, but in the interpretive kind of domain of the mind. So oftentimes we take what other people say or do personally. We think that it's about us. We think that it reflects our value, what I value to them. We think that it reflects who we are. If they make a judgmental comment, the truth is generally it reflects more them than it does us. People make judgmental comments. What they're really saying is that this is a standard that I hold myself to and I'm holding you to, and it's problematic. They're confessing. It's kind of like a confession. People are laying their judgments. But we're vulnerable to it. So that's why this second precept, or second, not precept, agreement, as he said, is so valuable. Don't take anything personally. However people treat you is about them. And let how you treat them be about you. How you love yourself, value yourself, love them, value them. Simple. It seems like the third one, which is not to have expectations, don't make assumptions, talks about that whole area between people where misunderstandings happen. So there's, be impeccable with your word, know the power of your word, not to, to bless and curse, not to take things personally, not to make assumptions, which often are the ones that lead to anger, irritation, impatience, so forth. Those sorts of things that go on between people. And then I'll just briefly mention the last, always do your best. It's funny because that might sound like perfectionism, and it's not. Always do your best and be merciful if your best, doesn't actually work out, But there's a way that precept or that agreement keeps you showing up in each circumstance. I mean, you could do a little experiment. Don't do your best and see what it feels like. See what it does inside. I think there's a limit to this. You can't do your best about everything. There's some things you have to let go of. I'm definitely not doing my best as a gardener. I'll tell you that. I'd have to be out there 40 hours a week. So there's certain things that you do let slide. So just one more time. Be impeccable about your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best. So I suggest just for this week to choose one of those that really calls to you and see what happens if you just take that on. Write it down, put it where you'll see it, the bathroom mirror, your computer, refrigerator, the counter, wherever. remind yourself of it. See where that takes you.